Today, our annual parliamentary hearing is a joint event by the Inter-Parliamentary Union and the UN, represented by the President of the General Assembly. The event, held for the first time virtually due to the pandemic, is part of a broader project to make parliaments more relevant in international democracy. And the hearing will contribute to a political declaration on corruption at the UN General Assembly in June. And the political declaration is already being negotiated by the Conference of the Parties of that convention, supported by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. It's obviously a subject that is of great concern. I'm delighted to say that we have 400 parliamentarians registered for the meeting. And a very big thank you to those who are joining us from the Far East, because it's very late there, late into the evening. But I think that it shows the concern that you have about corruption, combating corruption, and that it really is something that permeates all levels of society. So a few housekeeping points. My name is Claire Doole and I'm your moderator. It is going to be recorded and it's live streamed on UN Web TV. You can find interpretation in 3 languages, Arabic, French, and Spanish. And please do tweet. Tweet using the hashtag APU-UN 2021 or using the Twitter handle at IPU Parliament. So please do tweet throughout the proceedings. We're going to hear from some very eminent speakers, and also you'll have the time to take the floor. But parliamentarians, we will be quite squeezed for time. So we'll be setting a clock and you'll have 2 minutes to make your remarks or ask your questions. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to ask our first speaker, the President of the UN General Assembly, Volkan Bozkir, to make his opening remarks.
Durarte, Pacheco, President of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, distinguished members of Parliament, Excellencies, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the annual parliamentary hearing at the United Nations. Before starting, I would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, for taking over this very important task and wish you all the best during your endeavors. This year, our substantive discussion will focus on fighting corruption to restore trust in government and improve development prospects. This is pertinent to the General Assembly's 32nd special session on corruption, which will be held in June. As a fellow parliamentarian, your crucial role at the United Nations has always been clear to me. By translating UN resolutions into effective national legislation, parliamentarians turn our multilateral dreams into realities. And the flow of information goes both ways. Through sharing their national and local experiences, parliamentarians help to inform member states of the challenges and hopes of the people we serve. Parliamentarians also play an essential role in keeping governments accountable. I thank you for all your efforts to support multilateralism here at the United Nations and in your home countries. The General Assembly adopted the only legally binding universal anti-corruption instrument, the UN Convention Against Corruption, in 2003. Member states adopted this in response to the scourge of corruption, which perverts so many of our societies, with full appreciation of its devastating effect on development, human rights, peace and security, and the rule of law. While we have come a long way since 2003, corruption remains a pervasive global challenge and continues to erode public trust and democratic institutions. Member states furthered efforts to fight corruption through the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. SDG 16 and its targets require member states to build effective, transparent, accountable, and inclusive institutions and reduce illicit financial flows, strengthen the recovery and return of stolen assets, therefore reducing bribery and corruption. And this year, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, our joint efforts to fight corruption take on ever more urgency. Just like corruption, the pandemic is hitting the most vulnerable, those who depend on social protection and state services the hardest. In response to the pandemic, governments have announced trillions of dollars of emergency fiscal measure to support their people and economies. Many of you have been instrumental in these efforts. While this additional spending creates opportunities to build back better, it also creates risk. These funds have the potential to have less oversight and transparency as they move rapidly to meet the urgent needs resulting from the pandemic. Parliaments can play a critical role in ensuring that these funds are not diverted to corruption. We must also ensure that corruption does not deprive the most vulnerable of medical supplies or assistance programs. As vaccines against COVID-19 are distributed, it is crucial that every effort is taken to ensure that corruption does not prevent or impede the equitable availability and distribution of vaccines, or at worst, the falsification of the vaccines. The potential impact of corruption during the pandemic cannot be overstated. It could jeopardize a state's ability to respond to and recover from this crisis. Already, corruption has led to scarcity in essential protection, life-saving equipment, adequate assistance, and the provision of vital services. Corruption has caused thousands of extra lives to be lost during this pandemic. Excellencies, dear colleagues, promoting gender equality is a priority of my presidency, and I welcome the discussion on gender-sensitive anti-corruption policies that you will have tomorrow. Corrupt practices have a particularly adverse impact on the lives of women, socially, politically, and economically, further widening the gender equality gap. However, the political participation of women has been shown to have a positive effect on preventing corruption. The inclusive participation of women in government and decision-making roles is a catalyst to create more prosperous and robust societies. In countries with a higher number of women engaged in all levels of government, there is greater attention to and funding for the issues that affect the lives of the citizenry. This is motivation for us all to do what we can to increase gender parity. Distinguished colleagues, our efforts to combat corruption should also benefit from the Fathi panel, which will launch its final report this month. It will have recommendations on how to enact reforms to counteract practices fueling financial crime, corruption, tax evasion, and tax avoidance. This year, we have a chance to advance anti-corruption efforts with the first ever General Assembly special session against corruption in June. The special session will provide an opportunity to shape the global anti-corruption agenda for the next decade by advancing bold and innovative approaches, scaling best practices, and developing new standards and mechanisms. I welcome your active participation on this issue. Indeed, Resolution 8/14 of the Conference of the States Parties to the Convention encourages states parties to address the role of parliaments in preventing and combating corruption in its preparatory process. Your participation, including developing and maintaining effective and coordinated anti-corruption policies, is invaluable, including for prevention. I encourage you to remain engaged on this issue and to bring forth your expertise to fight the pervasive scourge of corruption. I thank you very much, and I wish you all the best in your endeavors today and tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bozkir, indeed, for the important efforts to fight, as you say, the scourge of corruption. I would now like to ask the President of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, Durarte Pacheco, to give his opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, President Bozkir, for your kind words. They were very important for us parliamentarians. And thank you also for your leadership. And thank you, Naomi, for your wonderful statement, which strike deep into our hearts. Dear colleagues, the parliamentary hearing organized with the UN, it is one of the most important events in our program of activities, because we think that their collaboration is essential, both to the UN and to the IPU. To the UN, because it will bring light to the perspective of parliamentarians about important issues. To the IPU, because we will strengthen our links with the UN and analyze the matters that affect all nations. So, we decide in this time of pandemic to keep this hearing in our program. It is not possible to have a presential meeting, but we will do it virtually. And we hope that next year it will be possible to meet again in New York, all of us. The parliamentary hearing of this year is about one issue that must be central to our work as parliamentarians. Corruption is one of the cancers to democracy. Like cancer, it starts slowly and in silence, one little step at a time, until a major organ stops working and the whole body politic is compromised. Fortunately, corruption can be fought effectively almost everywhere, and we know how to do this. The 2005 UN Convention Against Corruption gives us plenty of guidance. We just need to master the political will to implement it all the way. This requires legislation, and it requires resources to enforce laws that would otherwise remain inside our books. Globally, the financial losses due to corruption amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars a year, maybe more than official aid, about 140 billion annually. The Sustainable Development Goals will be much farther ahead today if that money could be recovered and put to good use, investing in universal health care, education, and social safety nets, for example. Even the response to the current pandemic might have been much stronger in some countries if public resources had not disappeared. Imagine, my friends, imagine how it must feel to have to pay a bribe to some public official to get a business license so you can earn a living. Imagine, my friends, how a good business owner must feel when a procurement contract she was bidding for is awarded to a less qualified company. because a bribe was paid. Imagine how corruption affects women when their own bodies became the currency in which a bribe must be paid. Imagine the damage done to society when people sense that some of their elected representatives are on the take. It is because of such real-life scenarios that corruption is highlighted in SDGs. SDG 16, the governance goal, includes a specific target that calls on governments to sustainably reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms by 2030. Implicit in this working is the idea that corruption, like most other crimes, cannot be eliminated altogether. But yes, it can be contained and reduced to no more than one occasional event. As serious, as complicated as this issue remains, make no mistakes. The world is better off today than only 20 years ago, when the first steps of the UN Convention were taken. Before the Convention, many acts of corruption did not even figure in criminal codes. In many places, it was even possible for companies to get a tax deduction for bribes paid to foreign actors. Now it is not possible. The Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption was created in 2002. We believe very much in this network, whose current chair, Speaker Mahmoud of Qatar, will speak later this morning, and we will show how it is possible to facilitate the ratification of the Convention by parliaments around the world, and for keeping the pressure on them, on all of us, to do more and better to implement the Convention. I hope by the time this meeting is over tomorrow, we will all feel with more energy in our anti-corruption efforts. Dear friends, this meeting is a great opportunity for us to join the voice of parliaments to the political declaration that UN General Assembly will adopt in June. Let's make the most of it. Thank you so much. Have a good work.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Pacheco. And now I would very much like to introduce our keynote speaker, Delia Ferreira Rubio, who is a board member of Transparency International. Ms. Rubio has a lot of experience as a special advisor to the Senate and to senators and representatives at the Argentine National Congress. Ms. Rubio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to this very important meeting, which brings me back to the congressional atmosphere. I have been working for many years in Argentina, and now I'm here as the chair of Transparency International, a network that has presence in more than 120 countries in the world, fighting corruption for more than 25 years. This is a very important moment for parliamentarians to regain voice and to participate in this anti-corruption agenda, particularly in view of the UNGAS meeting in June. And the title of the session that you have, of the hearing, is Fighting Corruption to Restore Trust. And really, if we want to restore trust or to rebuild trust in institutions, in leadership, in governments, in each other, in society, and to build better, to recover better, or to have a better new normal, it is essential that we restore the value of trust. Without trust, trust is impossible. We need truth to be a value in society, particularly in a time when misinformation, fake news, deep fake, or simply the idea of post-truth is dominating the world. So we need truth to restore trust. And in order to have truth, we need transparency. We need anti-corruption. We need information. We need open government. We need also more integrity, both in public and private sector. We need also less impunity. We can prevent corruption, but we have also to sanction those involved in corruption. And of course, we need effective accountability. Conventions are very important. Laws are very important, but they are not enough. We have to implement really those principles, standards, commitments, declarations that put the basis for our work, but do not guarantee the success of the fight against corruption. So the word that we have as order now is action, is implementation. And there is a very clear correlation between transparency and democracy. If you analyze the research on corruption and the quality of democracy in all countries in the world, you can see very clear correlation between corruption and the erosion of democracy. Corruption weakens institutions. Corruption undermines rule of law, attacks or affects rights and freedoms, affects quality of life of every citizen in the world. It is a human rights problem. The countries that are well positioned in our Transparency International Corruption Perception Index that I'm sure you look at every year, those countries that are well positioned as perceived as transparent in their public sector are those that rank better in the rankings of freedom of expression, respect of media freedom, democracy, a strong institution, effective checks and balances. But corruption not only undermines democracy, it affects development. It affects the rights of people. It affects delivery of public services. And it has been seen very clearly this year with COVID. We launched our CPI last January, and what we see is a clear correlation between corruption and the inability of countries and governments to give a good response in terms of healthcare systems. Those countries that has been unable to serve their population effectively in addressing the pandemic, those are the countries that suffer high levels of corruption. And it is clear because the money that should have been involved and invest in healthcare and hospitals, supplies, professionals, etc., were gone. Those monies, those resources were not there because they were in private pockets, in shell companies, in tax havens. So there is a clear correlation between the ineffective response to COVID and the levels of corruption in some countries in the world. And of course, the president of the assembly and from the IPU mentioned SDG 16. SDG 16 is really an enabler SDGs. Without getting that SDG in place and working, the money, the investment in other SDGs will not reach their objective. We cannot achieve health, sanitation, equality, the end of poverty all around the world, or protecting the environment if we don't stop corruption. Because where corruption is a global or systemic factor in a country, all the efforts are lost, because really we cannot achieve the Agenda 2030 if we don't tackle effectively corruption. COVID is an unprecedented global emergency, and emergencies increase notably the risk of corruption. We said that in all regions of the world when this started last year in February. And we warned countries and governments because the risk of corruption will be heightened during the emergency, and this was what happened. Really, from March till now, we have received thousands of reports of corruption in relation to COVID responses, particularly in some areas, what we call COVID contracts, which is public procurement in relation to supplies, tests, masks, ventilators, and now vaccines and treatments. We have seen that we have to stop corruption affecting the response from countries to this emergency. We have also seen clientelism in the delivery of public aid to people, public subsidies to businesses. We have also seen petty corruption in terms of accessing public services in hospitals and the healthcare. And there is a clear correlation also between corruption and the most anti-democratic and repressive responses to COVID. We have seen governments affecting civic rights. We have seen governments undermining rule of law. We have seen a huge concentration of power in executives, undermining checks and balances, putting constitutions and rule of law in quarantine. And there is a correlation between these undemocratic and repressive responses and the high levels of corruption in the country. This is the hour of parliamentarians. This is a time to change the combination of pandemic, urgency, and emergency rule to the combination of endemic, permanent, and public policies. We cannot keep on going with these emergency responses concentrated in the executives. Parliament has a voice that is crucial in this moment. In both scenarios, the international sphere and also in the national sphere. The agenda of anti-corruption is clear, but it is renovated. Illicit financial flows must be stopped. It cannot be done only at the national level. It has to be assumed as a global endeavor, as a global task. And in this sense, the traditional point, beneficial ownership transparency, asset recovery, mutual legal assistance, particularly if we want to tackle grant corruption, which is a very sophisticated and global form of corruption. We need to protect whistleblowers, and we need to guarantee access to information. We need transparency in the relation of money and politics, political integrity, campaign finance. We need to protect, and we need parliamentarians to protect civic space, and also the independence of the audit institutions and the judiciary. But there are new items, new issues in the anti-corruption agenda. Gendered effects of corruption, as has been mentioned by the previous speaker. And very much new issues, algorithmic transparency. We are using algorithm and artificial intelligence tools in order to decide public policies, access to jobs, access to credit, access to subsidies, access to freedom in some countries. We need parliamentarians to regulate the use of these tools and to guarantee transparency in these kind of algorithmic tools. And also, in particular, in relation with COVID, we need a new agenda that guarantee that if we face in the future other global emergency like the one we have been facing since 2020, we are ready to have in place the right public policies to avoid undermining rule of law, to avoid excessive concentration of power in the executives, to avoid the use of emergency as an excuse for populism, authoritarianism, or absolutism. The program is included in the 3 T's that we use at the start of this very brief conversation. We need to restore trust. For that, we need to reveal the value of truth, and for that, we need transparency. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope we can join forces at the UNGAS to have a clear agenda for the anti-corruption work in the following 10 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair of the Board of Transparency International, Delia, Rubio, and indeed the 3 T's of trust, truth, and transparency. We're now going to begin our session, which is looking at the Convention Against Corruption. Building blocks and implementation challenges. We're going to be looking at what the convention has achieved since it was adopted in 2005, what it could do better, what issues you'd like to address at the UNGAS, and of course, as we've heard, how emergencies like the pandemic should not derail anti-corruption efforts. So a few housekeeping points. We will have speakers who will speak for 5 minutes, and you will see that there is a timer that we're setting on the screen. And afterwards, we will ask parliamentarians for remarks or questions, and you will have 2 minutes. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker, who is the Speaker of the Shura Council of the State of Qatar and Chair of the Board of the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, GOPAC. It's a leading anti-corruption network of parliamentarians, an IPU observer, and has already made important submissions to the UNGAS. So it's my great pleasure to now ask Mr. Ahmed Al-Mahmoud to speak to us for 5 minutes. Thank you.
شكرا لك.
Thank you. I would like to welcome you all and thank you so much for the invitation. Your Excellency, the President of the 75th session of the United Nations, Mr. Durarte Pacheco, the President of the IPU, Ms. Ghada Fathi Waly, the Executive Director of the UNODC, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you. On behalf of the Shura Council in the State of Qatar, on behalf of the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, I am pleased to convey greetings to all of you. I wish this meeting every success to achieve the goals of the meeting, namely combating corruption, to regain trust in governments, and to achieve development. I would like to congratulate the IPU and the UN on the coordination and cooperation that continues between the two bodies, and this is embodied in the hearings organized in February of each year. This is an opportunity for UN bodies to engage with parliamentarians and to discuss issues and questions of concern to humanity. These hearings are also an opportunity for parliamentarians to provide opinions, suggestions, and proposals for reaching successful solutions of sensitive questions that affect the security and the stability of humanity. I think that this year's hearing focus on combating corruption is quite a wise decision, because combating corruption and freeing societies from corruption is vital. This is a menace and a cancer that spreads in societies and is also an obstacle in the way of development and a destabilizing factor in a number of societies. Hence, it is very important to highlight the role of UNCAC, the UN Convention Against Corruption, that has been ratified by the UN General Assembly in Resolution 58/9 in October 2003, which identifies contents of corruption and procedures and measures to be taken to eliminate corruption, in addition to criminalization penalties, in addition to elements pertaining to international cooperation, including technical assistance, exchange of information, and measures to implement the convention. It is clear that all brackets of societies and all entities and bodies and institutions of society are invited to take part in this endeavor. The role of parliaments and parliamentarians is vital, as they are setting legislation and monitoring performance of the executive. Legislation is a means to adopt legislation to enhance transparency, criminalization, and punishment. In addition to the role of monitoring the performance of the executive, and this is important so that senior officials would not commit the crimes of corruption that are punishable by law. Here, we would like to discuss the role of the 7th session of the organization that was held here, and I was elected a president, and now the headquarters is in Doha of the GOPAC. And I have been elected president, and I vowed that this would not be simply an honorary presidency. However, I seek to incorporate many activities focusing on the following: enhancing cooperation with the UN, enhancing cooperation with the IPU as well as the UN and other international parliamentary organizations and regional parliamentary organizations, to expand also the network of parliamentarians, in addition to contributing to the preparatory work of the special session of the UN on combating corruption. In addition, undertaking action to support the efforts of international organizations and governments as they seek to combat corruption. Despite the
wrap up your final thought, because I'm afraid we have gone over time. Thank you, sir.
I will.
I will. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic that has negatively impacted the activities of international organizations, we at the global organization have used virtual meetings as a tool, and we have adopted a strategy and the programs of the organization for 2021, 2022, and we have started holding meetings in our regional branches. We will work to make the global organization an active contributor, excellent contributor in the UN special session. We intend to organize meetings for the participants in the special session. We reaffirm that we will work with all relevant bodies, international and regional, to combat corruption and to rid our societies of corruption. We wish you every success in these meetings to serve our societies and to achieve the goals that we have set forth.
Mr. Speaker, for your remarks. It's now my pleasure to turn to Mr. Eric Anderson Machado, who's the permanent representative of Peru to the UN Vienna office and the co-facilitator of the political declaration to UNGAS. Mr. Anderson, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin my statement by thanking the Inter-Parliamentary Union for the invitation to participate in this important event focused on fighting corruption as a means to recovering trust in governance and promoting development. Corruption is a phenomenon that affects democratic governance, economic growth, confidence in institutions, and human rights. Moreover, it manifests in different ways, and it appears in an array of manners on the social, political, and economic levels, gravely affecting poverty elimination and sustainable development goals. And these implications are not of concern not just to the state, but to society as a whole, which would include the private sector and civil society. It's a phenomenon which can be seen throughout all institutions and society, and therefore it's necessary that the response to it be comprehensive. In this regard, the role of parliamentarians is key in combating this scourge, not only because of regulation and parliamentarian oversight, but also because parliamentarians provide legitimization in representing society as a whole. The international community also plays a key role in combating corruption. And this is why multilateral efforts are very important to interstate or internation cooperation and for asset recovery due to this transborder phenomenon. Currently, the main multilateral initiative to renew the commitment and political determination to tackle this scourge head on is the United Nations Special Session Against Corruption known as UNGAS 2021. In my capacity as co-facilitator of the political declaration of UNGAS, if I may, I'd like to make a few comments about the key elements of the document, which is still being analyzed and discussed by delegations. First, I'd like to highlight that all countries agree on the agreement and the importance of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, which is the only comprehensive worldwide instrument dedicated to this topic. The declaration follows the structure of UNCAC and dedicated to various segments, including prevention, asset recovery, technical assistance, criminalization, and international cooperation. Moreover, there is a segment on adopting measures that promote compliance with the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, considering the impact of corruption on social and economic development of countries. Given that this panel will be looking to focus on future challenges, I'd like to talk about the most important segment of this political declaration, which contains more innovative ideas and proposals which are geared to improving the response of the international community. This part of the text has been called Promoting an Anti-Corruption Framework with a Vision of the Future. The premise is clear. After 15 years of UNCAC being in force, it's undeniable that corruption has skyrocketed and it has broadened the spectrum with all sorts of new technologies and modalities. This is why the political declaration is particularly important given the quest for a new commitment by the international community to fight this scourge in its new dimensions and using as a basis UNCAC to do so. Since 2005, which is when the convention went into force, we have seen new types of corruption that have appeared which were not contemplated in this instrument, such as anticipated seizure, the exchange of direct information, responsibility of international civil servants, and others. To this, we must add the limited application of the convention for key mechanisms such as extradition or mutual legal assistance, which has only been undertaken through UNCAC 17 times, despite the fact that it's a crucial element in order to tackle the transnational nature of this scourge. This is why we believe it's important to undertake additional efforts to enhance UNCAC and especially to update it. In this regard, in my capacity as a permanent representative of Peru, I believe that it is both timely and appropriate to establish an intergovernmental process that can be used working with the assistance of national experts and representatives of all regions in order to identify gaps and ways to improve the convention. The result of these deliberations will provide a basis, if it's considered necessary, to present the Conference of Parties with normative proposals to enhance, strengthen, and complement the convention. We believe that this special session should be the beginning of a new phase in fighting corruption, whereby world leaders will commit to deepen it and in this way send a message of hope which is focused on reversing the harmful effects of corruption on the people. UNGAS UNGAS can contribute with the political commitment calling on all states, including parliamentarians, to end private and sector and civil society to deepen and enhance current mechanisms based on transparency in the legal framework we have to prevent, sanction, and promote cooperation. Therefore, if I may, I'd like to point out that there is a consensus about identifying corruption as the worst scourge that we have to tackle today, and we can only overcome it if there is a true commitment and transparency of all parties. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Machado, the co-facilitator of the political declaration, which will be adopted at the UN General Assembly in June. So the UN Office of Drugs and Crime is the custodian of this convention. So it's my great pleasure to ask the Executive Director of the UNODC and the UN Vienna Office, Ms. Ghada Waly, to speak to us for 5 minutes. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to join you for the annual parliamentary hearing. The UN Office of Drugs and Crimes cooperates closely with the Inter-Parliamentary Union, and I welcome this opportunity to further strengthen our engagement with you. I thank the President of IPU and the President of the General Assembly for leading this important discussion on a key priority under UNODC's mandate, namely preventing and fighting corruption and how we can advance efforts to restore trust and achieve the SDGs. UNODC sees parliamentarians as essential partners in promoting more effective anti-corruption laws, institutions, and oversight, and in strengthening implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption, which is the subject of this session. Together, we have come a long way since the convention entered into force in December 2005. Now, in 2021, corruption is recognized as a crime in most countries. The convention has near universal adherence with 187 parties. Combating corruption and recovering stolen assets are explicit targets under SDG 16, and the international community has recognized anti-corruption as key to achieving the whole of the 2030 agenda. The Convention and its peer review mechanism have raised awareness and kept corruption high on the international agenda. 71% of the states participating in the implementation review mechanism reported that the review process has helped them identify gaps in the national anti-corruption frameworks. As the guardian of the Convention and the Secretary of the Conference of the State Parties, UNODC trained over 450 officials from more than 75 countries in the past 2 years on the requirements of the Convention and on how to participate in the implementation review process. From the start of 2019 until mid-2020, UNODC helped review over 50 pieces of legislation and policies in 35 countries, supported more than 25 public institutions in 20 countries, and trained around 1,200 officials from more than 70 countries in prevention, investigation, and prosecution of corruption offenses. So we have a solid foundation for global anti-corruption action built on steady progress. Now the urgency to step up efforts has never been greater, as the COVID crisis and economic downturn have ramped up corruption risks. And as Ms. Rubio has just said in her speech, while conventions and laws are important, it is about implementation. And this is what really matters. People are losing jobs and social protection in the crisis. Women, minorities, and marginalized groups have suffered most, and they suffer disproportionate and compounded impacts of corruption through exclusion from economic relief and access to justice and services. The pandemic has reversed development progress for the first time in 2 decades, and the World Bank estimates that there were up to 124 million new poor last year due to COVID. A world made poorer and more fragile by the pandemic is also more vulnerable to transnational organized crime. These crimes, including human trafficking and migrant smuggling, drugs and firearm trafficking, are further enabled and facilitated by corruption. Now more than ever, governments need to use the tools provided by the UN Convention Against Corruption to further strengthen anti-corruption bodies, improve oversight over stimulus investments, and increase transparency and accountability. In support, UNODC has fast-tracked assistance to member states requesting advice to strengthen financial and fiscal integrity frameworks in the pandemic. We have published guidelines on accountability and the prevention of corruption in the allocation and distribution of emergency economic response packages, as well as guidance on the manufacturing, allocation, and distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine. Even as the crisis has heightened vulnerabilities and corruption risks, global momentum has been gathering to improve anti-corruption responses, and we need to seize this moment and make 2021 a year of anti-corruption action. UNODC is supporting member states to elaborate an ambitious political declaration for the first ever UN General Assembly special session against corruption in June, which will set out the strategic and comprehensive approach to the future fight against corruption. The UNGAS declaration will be taken forward at the 9th session of the Conference of State Parties Against Corruption in Sharm el-Sheikh in December. In the lead up to UNGAS, the SG has spearheaded efforts to improve UN system-wide coordination. We have adopted a common position on corruption, which was developed by the Global Task Force on Corruption led by UNODC, UNDP, and UNDTPPA. UNODC has also increased its focus on 2 important areas of anti-corruption action. Firstly, we are addressing gender dimensions of corruption. Diversity, equal representation, and gender equality are powerful protective factors against corruption. Women also suffer specific impacts of corruption, and responses must take their needs and voices into account. And second, UNODC is sharpening its focus on the role of technology. The use of cryptocurrencies to launder money, for example, presents new challenges to law enforcement. At the same time, big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain, cloud-based platforms, biometrics, and fintech offer new solutions for preventing and detecting corruption. Digitalization and automation of procurement and compliance processes can increase transparency while reducing the human factor contributing to corruption risks. We need to invest more in supporting governments, particularly in developing countries, to take advantage of technology while building law enforcement capacities to stay ahead of the criminals. UNODC will be further strengthening such operational support through the Riyadh Initiative for Enhancing International Anti-Corruption Law Enforcement Cooperation. Launched under the G20 last year, The initiative will create a Vienna-based global network to build and enhance direct informal contacts between law enforcement practitioners to support them in pursuing complex cross-border corruption and money laundering cases. Moreover, UNODC has a new strategy for 2021 to 2025, which will guide our field officers and global programs in scaling up support to counter illicit financial flows and corruption and address linkages with terrorism and transnational organized crime.
Ms. Waly, if you could just finish your final sentence, that would be great.
The strategy puts special emphasis on partnerships with governments, civil society, and the private sector. Engaging young parliamentarians is also a priority. We look forward to strengthening cooperation with IPU's Forum of Young Parliamentarians, building on the work we have done with the Africa Young Parliamentarians Union. Together, we can encourage and strengthen the role of young people, of society and communities in anti-corruption as an investment in their future. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have the opportunity in 2021 to reinforce anti-corruption action. UNODC looks forward to working with you and supporting you. Many thanks once again, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Executive Director of the UNODC. And indeed, you're mentioning the role of young parliamentarians. So it's with great pleasure that I now introduce Ms. Cynthia Lopez Castro, who's an MP in the Congress of Mexico and a member of the Bureau of Forum of Young Parliamentarians. Ms. Castro, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to take part in this parliamentary hearing devoted to the fight against corruption, to restore trust in government and improve development. Mexico was an active participant in the negotiation of the UN Convention Against Corruption since the early 2000s, the only legally binding multilateral instrument against corruption. As a member of the IPU Board of Young Parliamentarians, I know this is a vital concern for young people and many times keeps valuable members of society from participating more actively in politics. Politics as a profession faces a crisis of reputation and trust all around the world. In many countries, being a politician carries an immediate suspicion of corruption. Regrettably, this is not fortuitous or unfounded. This suspicion is backed by numerous and notorious high-level cases of political corruption, embezzlement, money laundering, etc. At the same time, I have witnessed that most public servants and parliamentarians are not in it for the money, but rather due to a true vocational calling and willingness to serve their fellow countrymen. The problem here, as with many reputational issues, is the many pay for the wrongdoings of a notorious few. We need to transform this conception of public leadership. Politicians must be honest, trustworthy, and accountable. In the last couple of years, the government of my country has emphasized a new style of government based on a concept of austerity. Even if I am a member of the opposition, I fully agree with this principle and the notion that true politicians must aspire to serve and not to profit. In the current legislature of Mexican Congress, we have taken the fight against corruption very seriously. In the last 3 years, we have approved several reforms related to transparency, accountability, and the proper punishment of wrongdoing. Also, we have approved new typification of corruption crimes, such as illicit remuneration of public servants in the federal code, and the classification of corruption as a serious crime in the Constitution. However, these measures have not been enough to change the perception of Mexican society. Corruption is still identified as a main concern by most citizens. In order to fully restore trust in politics, each and every one of us, active politicians, must adopt a personal commitment with honesty and transparency. The truth is that opportunities for corruption will always exist, and I am constantly approached by firms and acquaintances who ask for favors. However, I have made it a case for myself not to intercede for anybody, even to facilitate the slightest of public services. Countries and individuals should renew their vows every so often to remind themselves of the commitment they have adopted. To improve its implementation, I believe we need even more effective mechanisms to be able to signal when a government is failing to meet these commitments. It will be also useful to increase the participation, as we are doing now, the participation of Parliament in the review of mechanisms. The effort to combat corruption remains central in relation to the current pandemic. Unfortunately, we have witnessed opportunistic officials who have tried to benefit from the emergency, selling and buying personal protection equipment at overprices, extending contracts without the proper transparency and competition, even establishing illegal side businesses with the help of family members and proxies. Other painful expressions of corruption have been the instances of cronyism and bribery in the application of the vaccines. As a member of the board of the Young Parliamentarians, I express my full commitment to fight against corruption, and I urge this body to include a strong condemnation of such practices in the forthcoming political declaration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Ms. Castro. Indeed, for keeping to time and speaking slowly, because the interpreters would really appreciate if people can speak slowly as they interpret. And as Ms. Castro was saying, indeed, corruption in the times of COVID and these vaccines is really key that it is combated. So I'd like to thank all of our four speakers, and now ask parliamentarians to raise their hand and to ask their questions or make a comment. If you're going to make a comment, we are going to set the clock to 2 minutes. So I can see that we have the parliamentarian from Oman. So please, sir, you have 2 minutes.
عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. شكرا للمتحدثين. أود في بداية حديثي أن أتقدم باسمي.
I'd like to begin by expressing to you on behalf of the Omani Parliament our warm thanks for the organisation of this meeting this year on the topic of tackling corruption and improving development. We wish to affirm the importance attached by the Arab Parliament to the issue of the fight against corruption, since this is a sine qua non condition to ensure the success of development projects in Arab countries. We need to implement an effective mechanism in this regard. We'd also like to reaffirm the importance for the Arab Parliament of reiterating our commitment to fighting corruption in all areas, and that through policies that lay the foundations for good governance and that show the need for the transfer of digital information. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a certain number of proposals, including the establishment of a platform for best practices, as well as the introduction of model legislation, which have already proven their effectiveness in fighting corruption. We should also benefit from the lessons learned and the challenges of the pandemic by ensuring the promotion of technologies used in fighting the pandemic itself. We should also look closely at how we can set up specialized courts to address corruption-based cases. To conclude, the Arab states adopt strategic policies to prevent corruption. and to fight this scourge in order to improve the living conditions of our citizens. Thank you very much.
To the parliamentarian from Oman. I would now like to give the floor to the parliamentarian from Thailand. You have 2 minutes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Indeed, we can hear you. Please,
Okay, thank
the
you very
floor is
much.
yours.
Okay. Mr. President, Madam Moderator, dear colleagues, my name is Dr. Petdao Tomina, member of the House of Representatives of Thailand. Aside from the need to strengthen national legal frameworks in combating corruption, the Parliament of Thailand reaffirms our strong commitment to strengthening its budget's oversight functions in the fight against corruption, particularly in the context of COVID-19 crisis. In addition to the existing two anti-corruption standing committees in both chambers, a parliamentary special committee has therefore been set up in the lower house since June 2020 to make sure that the government's management of $76.2 billion COVID-19 recovery program is done, not only in a timely and efficient manner, but also in a transparent and accountable fashion, as well as to oversee other social and economic problems resulted from the pandemic. Bearing in mind the need to engage all relevant stakeholders in the fight against corruption, the special committee is also working in parallel with an anti-corruption network called Good Governance Clinic Against Corruption in certain provinces under the guideline of the Office of Public Sector Anti-Corruption Commission. The above said network is a new surveillance mechanism at the local level, working in collaboration with non-public sectors with the aim to monitor and scrutinize the government spending on COVID-19 stimulus package, especially infrastructure, mega projects, and other public procurement, while promoting access to government data and active participation of the civil society. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to the parliamentarian from Thailand. I would now like to give the floor to the parliamentarian from Turkey for 2 minutes. Thank you.
Hello, are you able to hear me?
We can hear you.
Great, thank you so much. I would like to wish everybody good health. And as we're fighting this pandemic, I hope that as humankind, we can all survive. We know that we will not be all safe until everybody is safe. So it's a process where we're realizing how interdependent we are and how interconnected we are. Setting that aside, of course, fighting corruption is a global challenge. It needs a worldwide approach involving both developing and developed nations. So we need multilateral action in this area. Corruption and development are mutually connected concepts, as it was already mentioned, and there is both economic, social consequences to corruption that are enormous. And in this context, of course, as we're dealing with the pandemic, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to ensure that all people have equal access to affordable, effective, and safe COVID-19 medicine and vaccines. And everybody should be equal in that sense as well, which makes it more challenging. And there may be possibilities for, I'm afraid, corruption within the COVID pandemic, as we're fighting the COVID pandemic as well. As Turkey, as Grand National Assembly, we prioritize delivering a global response to fighting corruption also during the pandemic. My question is, we talked about artificial intelligence tools. They may be helpful in fighting against corruption. However, we also need to realize that there is something called a digital divide. So there are some countries, some underdeveloped countries who don't even have access to internet, or they don't have the necessary equipment or the structure to be able to use even the basic internet functions. So that is what I wanted to ask. How do we respond to that challenge? Thank you very much. I hope everybody is safe, sound, and healthy.
Thank you very much to the parliamentarian from Turkey. And indeed, that question about artificial intelligence is key to combating corruption. But what about countries where they don't have the technology and there's the digital divide? Would any of our eminent speakers like to answer that question from Turkey? Please raise. Thank you very much, Mr. Machado. Indeed, give me a sign, and thank you for answering the question.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'd like to express my thanks for the question from the distinguished participant from Turkey. One of the fundamental parts of the political declaration will be based on cooperation and the cooperation that we need to have between countries so that the fight against corruption is active. It's particularly important to be able to work together and indeed to assist those countries that have fewer resources to see in which way we can complement the efforts that they're making to fight this scourge. So specifically, it will be very important for cooperation in the chapter on cooperation to be very clear, to ensure that there is an availability among all states parties to participate in bolstering this commitment, and that to help those countries that need extra assistance in fighting corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Machado, for those words. I would now like to give the floor to the parliamentarian from Kenya.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Nairobi, Kenya. I'd like to thank the presenters. That this is very good to have these conversations. But I would like to just mention two things. We have said that implementation. Can somebody hear me?
We can hear you. Yes, please do carry on.
Oh, sorry. I saw you speaking. I thought you were speaking to me. So thank you very much. I think those are very good presentation. Oh, la, la. Just adjust my camera. Very good presentations. I thank you. I have a question with regard. I mean, I'm going to speak to the declaration. We have identified that laws are not enough. Institutions may already be too corrupt to self-regulate. For me and for us in Kenya, we think that the hope lies in good leadership. How do we make sure that the declarations and the actions for 2021 include ways in which good people, good leaders come into parliament, for instance, or into the executive? Because only with the political will or executive will do we then have a chance to implement some of the things that we've said we need to implement. So I hope that the declarations are going to be heavy on things that are going to ensure enablers of implementation, as opposed to the same old things that perhaps where we are looking at institutions and building capacity of perhaps the same old people and institutions, and looking at the same old ways in which we've been fighting corruption for the last many years. So I hope really that we will look at new innovative ways. And also I have also concerns, of course, with the digital divide, where in some parts of where I come from, we don't even have a 2G even for to 2G coverage for connectivity. So again, we need to look at how do we make sure that the fight against corruption doesn't entrench inequalities further, where then the countries that then are able to access technology are then able to also benefit from anti-corruption tools, and we continue wallowing in corruption as well. I thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. Again, another concern about the digital divide in fighting corruption, but perhaps Ms. Lopez Castro, I might put the question, and also thank you very much, Ms. Waly, to that question about how do we make sure that we've got the right people. Ms. Waly, if I go to you first, as you had your hand up, thank you very much. And then if Ms. Castro would like to add anything about how do we make sure that we've got the right people in parliaments to fight corruption.
Thank you. A very a greeting for Nairobi. It's a pleasure to hear you. And well, I think is the key is first is our generation, that we are like the hope to making politics in a different way. We need to be like very in the commitment to serve others, or not to be in with money or with some crimes about corruption. I think it's our generation that has the big challenge to change the things. And the other thing I will say is to strengthening is the institutions to carry these practices, to having stronger institutions that allow us to eradicate corruption. And well, I think it's our generation that can do the things different. In all the countries we have the laws, but sometimes they are not applied correctly. So what we need to do is to do, each of us that we are parliamentarians, that we are representatives of our nation, the things different. And I think the corruption should not be linked to the economy of a country. For example, in Mexico, we have one of the poorest states in the country, that is not the best economy, is one of the less corrupted, that is Yucatan. That also it was the state when it was the last, in 2003, it was the UN Convention in Mexico, and it's not the richest state, and it's one of the states with less corruption. So I think it is not linked corruption with a high economy. So countries as, for example, yours and mine, even we are not a very strong economy, we should be against corruption. So it should not be linked. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. And Ms. Waly, thank you for your patience. If you would also like to respond to that question from Kenya. If you were able to put your mic on, that would be even better. Thank you.
The lady from Kenya had two questions in one about the digital divide, and one about suggesting that we need the right leadership in place. It is true, I agree with her that leadership matters, but leadership cannot work alone and on its own. And I do not agree that leadership is enough. With leadership, we need to empower institutions, we need to continue to build capacity, we need to raise awareness at the community level, so that there is a role that is empowering communities, so that they hold their parliamentarians accountable and they hold their governments accountable. So the voice of the people and the awareness of the people is important. And here comes the role of civil society organizations, NGOs such as Transparency International, in hearing their voices. And they have, our keynote speaker spoke about receiving thousands of messages about corrupt practices. So having different channels to report corruption is very important. Having the role of civil society and engaged community is very important. And of course, the role of youth and youth parliamentarians. parliamentarians. So yes, leadership matters, but leadership is not enough. Technical assistance and capacity building and review mechanisms such as the one I referred to are very important, because this is how you transfer knowledge from a country to another, so that countries learn from each other how to address corruption, how to fight corruption. This is on the what matters to make an impact. The other part of the question, which was on the digital divide, by mere coincidence, the World Day of Social Justice is on February 20th. And the World Day for Social Justice has as a theme a call for social justice in the digital economy. And it is speaking about the divide, the digital divide, and the fact that some countries have the infrastructure needed and some countries do not have the infrastructure. I think the world has realized that we all need the needed digital infrastructure, and governments have realized that this is an area of investment. So we need governments to invest to bridge this gap in digital divide, and we need IFIs, international financial institutions, to provide governments with the needed resources and invest in infrastructure. It is not just good for development, but it's also a huge source of income. So the private sector is invited to invest in infrastructure to bridge this digital divide, and governments have to change their priorities. And while investing, continue to invest in health and in education and in the software, we also need them to invest in the infrastructure needed, because if this pandemic has taught us something, one of the most important things is that virtual world is here to stay. A new normal will require this infrastructure. So I think many governments will be pushed to reprioritize their investment plans, and IFIs and financial institutions are strongly encouraged to help, and the world needs to be in solidarity and stand in solidarity to achieve social justice by closing the gap on digital divide.
Thank you very much, Ms. Waly, for your very comprehensive answer to the parliamentarian from Kenya there. I would now like to ask the parliamentarian from China to ask a question or make a remark. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me? Very glad to attend this hearing. Thanks our distinguished guests for their remarks. This hearing is touching the very crucial and important issues for anti-corruption. I think our countries should refuse to provide the havens for the corruptions. And since the CAC took effect, it has played crucial roles. China support the conventions as a main channel in the international cooperation. We support to hold the UN case in preparing for the political declaration documents. Our colleagues is working and will continue to work very closely with colleagues. Our position is very clear, has been made there. The National People's Congress of China plays positive roles in fighting against corruption. Just in the recent years, NPC adopt several legislations, including the amendment of China Constitution and the National Supervisory Law to strengthening the work fight against the corruption. And in the past year, NPC Standing Committee listened to the special report on that work. NPC is willing to contribute to the global anti-corruption issues by strengthening communications and sharing experiences with colleagues globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your remarks. I would now very much like to encourage people, different genders, different regions of the world to all make their contribution. And we're now going to go to Syria. You have 2 minutes. I'm hoping that we are going to be able to make connection with Syria. This may be a very good example of the digital divide. So let's see whether we can contact the parliamentarian from Syria. I'll allow them a few seconds to see whether they can connect with us before I'll go on to the next speaker who's raised their hand. Well, we hope that we will be able to hear from the parliamentarian from Syria later. Let me now then go to the parliamentarian from Zimbabwe.
For giving me this opportunity to make a contribution on the topic of fight against corruption. My name is Robson Mavenyengwa, MP from Zimbabwe. Corruption is affecting development globally, and the governments, including our country, Zimbabwe, are making frantic efforts to reduce it. The scourge has affected development, especially in the developing countries, in which Zimbabwe is one of the developing countries. I will share on what Zimbabwe has done so far in the fight against corruption. Zimbabwe is also making efforts to eradicate corruption as it established institutions such as the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission and the National Prosecuting Authority, among other arms of government to fight corruption. ZAC has been given powers under the supreme law of the country, Section 255 of the Constitution, to do its mandate without fear or favor. So far, the country has managed to arrest high-profile people, including sitting and former ministers, senior government and council employees, politicians, and those in the private sector involved in corruption, as the President of the Republic, His Excellency Comrade Dr. Emmerson Mnangagwa, is on record denouncing corruption and urging ZAC to arrest anyone found wanting in many of his speeches. Most of the cases are now at the courts, including that of the now Minister of Health, who is alleged to have misused COVID-19 funds meant to procure protective equipment. Zimbabwe, in collaboration with International Criminal Justice, that is ICJ, and with the support given by the European Union, launched a whistleblowing application mechanism in Harare to protect and reward whistleblowers of corruption.
Thank you, sir. If you would like to finish your thought, we will need to move on to another parliamentarian. So if you could just finish your thought quickly.
Thank you very much. As Parliament, we are also playing our oversight role on ministries and government departments, scrutinizing monthly and quarterly reports, also visiting projects to qualify money allocated to those projects and recommend investigations if any of the if there are any suspicions. As Zimbabwe, we are in support of the global initiative in fighting corruption. We are really behind all global instruments which we have already joined as a nation to make sure we reduce corruption in Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor for 2 minutes to the parliamentarian from Fiji.
Thursday morning, and it is a beautiful evening here, and I only wish yourselves could join us here in Fiji. I would also like to thank the presenters for their presentation this morning. Fiji ratified UNCAC on the 14th of May in 2008. Since then, Fiji is very serious about combating corruption. That from last week's sitting of Parliament, there was a bill passed to establish a specialized anti-corruption division of the High Court and an anti-corruption division of the Magistrates Court, which will be presided over by judges and magistrates who will deal specifically with cases relating to anti-corruption law. So we hope that this will assist in our fighting against corruption. My question this morning is probably for Ms. Rubio, the chair of Board of Transparency International. The question is, how do we ensure that the delivery of services for pandemics such as COVID-19 are not interrupted or derailed through corruptive practices? That is the question I would like to ask Ms. Rubio.
Thank you very, very much, Madam. And also I'd like to say thank you for going well beyond the call of duty, because I understand that it's 3 o'clock in the morning in Fiji. So thank you very much for joining us so late. Now, that was a question to Delia Ferreira Rubio from Transparency International. The question was, how do we ensure that the pandemic does not derail anti-corruption efforts? Ms. Rubio, if you would like to give an answer to our parliamentarian from Fiji, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the question. Of course, the first thing would be to guarantee transparency in the procedures and the delivery. What we are seeing particularly now, and we are very worried about that, is the lack of transparency in terms of vaccines procurement, contracts, deals with labs, and also the lack of transparency in terms of distribution of those vaccines, access to the vaccine. The time is now to guarantee transparency in every detail related to vaccines and vaccination, both things, the acquisition of the vaccines and the distribution of the vaccines. We have seen some parliaments guaranteeing confidentiality of everything. In these kind of matters, the only ask for confidentiality, which is reasonable, has to do with the formulas, because there can be competition there, or the problem of fake vaccines or false products. But prices which are paid by public resources, distribution which should be guaranteed on a fair basis. And we are seeing in developed and underdeveloped countries corruption in terms of line jumping, not waiting for your turn in terms of public officials or other friends or cronies. So we need transparency in vaccines and treatments, and we need the checks and balances and the accountability very active and effective now, not in 3 years, as has happened in previous pandemic situations like the Ebola.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rubio, for answering that question. I would now like to give the floor to the parliamentarian from Angola. You have 2 minutes.
Yes, good afternoon. I'd like to thank the leadership of this audience for their commitment on this theme. This annual parliamentarian hearing addresses a theme that is central to the government of the President of the Republic of Angola, João Lourenço. When elected in 2017, President defined the fight against corruption as one of the main pillars of his work. As a result of this effort, since 2018 to 2020, Angola rose 21 places in Transparency International's Corruption Index. Indeed, the National Assembly of Angola has been playing a crucial role in approving internal and international legal framework necessary to prevent the fight against corruption. Thus, several international laws and treaties were approved. I highlight, among others, legislative initiative, the approval of the new penal code that, among others, has aggravated the penal framework resulting from the practice of corruption crimes. Ladies and gentlemen, it should be noted that the monthly debate in last January this year, under the theme at the National Assembly, was the fight against impunity as a factor for good governance. This debate includes the fight against corruption as all levels. And the decision was that it is essential for good governance and building a society of peace, justice, and social progress, indeed, to fight corruption. Excellencies, I want to reiterate the strong commitment of the National Assembly that the future of the upcoming generations in our countries goes through energetic actions that current leaders are taking to remove the heavy burden of corruption. For this reason, fighting against corruption, more than a moral and legal imperative, is an indispensable condition for the sustainable development of our societies. So I'd like also to say that we are
Madam, if I could just ask you to finish your last remark, because we're pressed for time.
I'm finishing. I just want to reiterate that it is important for to reiterate that in Angola we have the political commitment to fight corruption, and it is important that the international community can work as a whole to fight that heavy burden in our societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for making that commitment. I would now like to ask the parliamentarian from Algeria for 2 minutes to give his remarks or to ask our eminent speakers a question.
Bonsoir. Vous m'entendez?
Oui, on vous attend. Merci. Please,
Donc,
you have
je
2
vous
minutes.
remercie de m'avoir donné l'occasion de participer à ce débat ô combien intéressant. Je remercie au passage.
In this very interesting debate. It shed some light on the methodology. It is a major concern in my country, and thus we've ratified the United Nations Charter in 2004. We then did much to promote the legislative framework, but unfortunately there's still a phenomenon which puts constraints on economic, political, and social life in our country. Despite the political determination of the state and civil society, we have many associations that intervene in this area to fight corruption. But unfortunately, it's a phenomenon which has taken root. Today, the President of the Republic is leading a merciless fight against corruption, and at this very moment, there are investigations underway. We've had to incarcerate a number of high-level officials. So there is a desire to overhaul the Constitution, and we have the independent high authority, which is vested with responsibility for prevention, transparency, and fighting corruption. I believe that this phenomenon, and indeed you did well to program it as a theme in this discussion. It's a phenomenon that has become universal, and I believe that poor economies suffer from it, and I would like to see the presidency of the organization give us take stock of the work for 2020, and Algeria is unfortunately very badly ranked in that report, and we need help and some orientation in order to be able to put an end to this phenomenon. We unfortunately observe that despite our strong will to move forward and the state's commitment as well as that of civil society, that the phenomenon continues to be one that is very dangerous for our economy, for our social cohesion. And I believe that is the case for many poor countries, but also for wealthy countries. And there, I believe that the role of Transparency International needs to be even more key in dealing with this phenomenon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to the parliamentarian of Korea for 2 minutes. We're just waiting for the parliamentarian from Korea to connect. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next parliamentarian, so please just bear with us.
Hello. Yes.
Please, sir, the floor is yours. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I'm very proud to be part of this very important undertaking. I'd like to pay tribute to the host of this gathering, the United Nations and IPU in particular. And I look forward to the UN General Assembly special session in June, and also in particular, the political declaration to be issued there. Actually, Korea has its share of trouble in dealing with corruption problems, especially when Korea's economy is developing very fast, and one of the unfortunate outcome is to the amount of corruption that we have to deal with. We have had an institutional framework in place now. We have the Executive Commission for the anti-corruption problems. We have the Audit Board, which are very, very active. But we have found that having the institutional framework in place is just the beginning of the work, not the end of the work, not the completion of the work. And we found that sustaining the momentum for anti-corruption, the campaign is probably more difficult to set in motion the institutional process. And in this regard, we found that the roles of the civil society, the roles of the press are critical in maintaining the momentum, and our Korea's National Assembly allowing the unlimited access to our proceedings from the civil society and the press. And my question is that, so how the roles and importance of civil society and the press are dealt with in terms of the drafting of the political declaration to be issued in June UN General Assembly special session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that question. And indeed, it was, how do you see the role of civil society and the press in the drafting of that political declaration? And if one of our speakers would like to give me a sign who would like to take that one, thank you very much, Mr. Machado, the permanent representative from Peru. The floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the distinguished representative of Korea for that question. Well, indeed, yesterday we met with members of civil society. And I believe that I said before, fighting corruption is not a topic that's limited just to the states. A very important role needs to be played by the private sector and civil society. And in that regard, it's very important to get feedback and comments so that we can consider how we can work with the political dimension. The civil society is not involved in the negotiations process, and I think it's important to get their comments and proposals. They need to send them to their delegations and representatives so they can be involved in the process in that way and get feedback through. And again, as a co-facilitator, I met yesterday with an NGO that represents a segment of international civil society. But once again, I believe that it's important for there to be that relationship established between civil society, the private sector, and their respective delegations, and they need to get their comments to the delegates to be reflected in the political declaration. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Machado. I would now like to ask the parliamentarian from the UK to ask a question or to make a comment for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Really fascinating presentation so far. It's really a question today. Recently, the Oxford Internet Institute published a report on industrialized disinformation. So I'm really wondering what our speakers think about the potential impact or the extent to which organized social media manipulation could undermine attempts to tackle corruption.
Thank you very much for that question about whether organized social media is provoking this phenomena of disinformation. Perhaps this is, unless one of the speakers is giving me a clear indication, I would think that that was for Ms. Rubio, who's the board member of Transparency International. The chair of the board of Transparency International, to get your title totally correct. Ms. Rubio.
Thank you very much. I really mentioned this because it is impossible to restore trust without restoring truth. And we are in a time of fake news, misinformation, the abuse of social media, which can be a marvelous tool, but we have to fight to restore truth. And civil society is doing some part of that, but we need, of course, the collaboration of the private sector and the platforms running this kind of media, social media. Some of them are already working in trying to stop misinformation. The problem is that we are in a way giving the role of the state to private companies to decide what is misinformation or fake news or not, or acceptable messages or not acceptable messages. That is a great risk. So we have to work together, and we need parliamentarians to set the regulatory framework in order to guarantee that this power is not abused by anyone. As with other artificial intelligence tools or algorithmic tools, as I mentioned in my agenda for anti-corruption, in this case, what is important is that to keep in mind that all these technical and digital marvelous things that allows us to be connected together today are just tools that can be used for good or evil. So we have to regulate this if we are not going, or if we don't want to go for what I call algocracy, a government by algorithms, as we saw in UK with the exams scandal in September last year. It was an algorithm decided on the future of people. We cannot accept that. We need transparency in algorithms. We need to avoid biases and discrimination in the use of this kind of tools, and also a regulation, a framework, some principles, basic principles for social media use.
Ms. Rubio, thank you very much. And I was wondering whether Ms. Lopez wanted to add anything to that about the role that organized social media can sometimes play, a negative role in disinformation. Ms. Lopez, if you would like to make a few words, then the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yeah, of course, it's a very common problem in all of our nations that social media is like in a double tool. For in the one hand, it's a tool for transparency, and for example, I think in all of your countries, social media helps to supervise the political. The politicians, because all the time we are like looped by the social media, but in the other hand sometimes are a lot of fake news. So I think, well, in Mexico we will start to discussing about regulating some terms of social media, so because not like to combat against this misinformation. So I will be happy to share about this bill, so maybe it can be helpful in other countries, because yes, a lot of fake news, and also a lot of things about, for example, women that are in social media that affect us. So of course I think that it's very important. Maybe the next forum we can talk more about the tool of social media, so it helps again corruption and transparency. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your remarks. And Ms. Waly, I know that you would also like to join the conversation.
Very briefly, I just wanted to inform our guests and our participants of an initiative that was launched by the United Nations called Verified. And Verified is on Twitter and on social media and on Facebook. And it is an initiative to alert people, users of social media, to verify the information they get. And I think this initiative, which is, getting more attention and growing, is going to be and is going to have an important role in raising the awareness and guiding users of social media as to how to verify the information through a list of, how to filter the information they're getting and how to go through the information and verify it. I believe that the world needs to get together. This cannot be a one country legislation here or there. I think the world needs to get together to discuss how should we address the challenges that are coming with the increase of use of social media, because as Ms. Rubio said, it is a sword that has two edges. It can be used for good or for evil. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to let the members know that I'm going to take two more speakers, and then I'm going to go back to our speakers from Qatar and from Peru, and Ms. Waly and also Ms. Lopez Castro, to give you 2 minutes to make some final remarks. So I'm just giving you a warning about that. But I would now like to go to the parliamentarian from Togo. Please ask a question of our speakers or give us your comments. You have 2 minutes. Let us see whether we can make connection.
I too would like to heartily congratulate you on the interest shown by the international community in the interest of fighting corruption, especially the elements of response provided by the fight, especially for developing our countries. Turning to this matter, I'd just like to verify the methodology used, because since 2003, when the mechanism was triggered, the verification of effectiveness has not been very conclusive, and it seems there might be a reason to go back and review the methodology. Perhaps, well, unfortunately with this pandemic, but initially it was supposed to be an evaluation of values, monetary values and other factors. But today what we're doing is we're moving towards verification, which is sometimes verification of deliveries, of procurement. Who would we refuse and who would we grant the request? This is difficult to evaluate. It's difficult for the international community to handle. So I think we need to really go back to and evaluate our methodology in terms of evaluating those requests. That's one of the concerns I want to underscore for you in this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would now like to go to our last parliamentarian for this session from Mexico. You have 2 minutes.
Good morning, one and all. It's a great pleasure to speak to you and to be listening to you about this very important topic, combating corruption. I believe that the pandemic has given us an opportunity so that in many countries we can accelerate towards digitalization and expedite our efforts against this trend, use technologies to combat it. I think it's key to strengthen the fight against corruption using channels of transparency. And as other speakers have mentioned, such as Turkey, it's necessary to strengthen the digital infrastructure. But I think it's also important that the large challenges for fighting corruption and poverty is the digital tools available to us. Another area that's important to strengthen is participation of organized civil society, of autonomous organization, not just transnational, international, but also other organizations that can work in each and every one of our countries. These bodies that help us to guarantee access to information. And I must say, in my country, Mexico, recently, we've seen threats. And there seems to be a link between that and covering up information, and between that and not having a head-on attack against corruption. I think that it is an opportunity that we must not let slip by. We need to accelerate our efforts towards digital life in order to strengthen infrastructure, connectivity, transparency, and to work together using technology and participation of civil society. We can work together to really fight corruption. We could take significant steps in this direction, and the role of parliaments would be vital in this regard to achieve our goal. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for concluding the remarks and the questions from the parliamentarians for this session. I would now like to go back to our eminent speakers and ask them for 2 minutes for their final takeaway messages. So if I could please give the floor to Mr. Ahmed Al-Mahmoud, Speaker of the Shura Council. Sir, the floor is yours. It seems that we have a connectivity problem with Qatar. So let me ask Mr. Eric Anderson Machado for your 2-minute takeaway remarks to conclude this session.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you and everybody who's participated today. It's been great to be able to hear from all of the parliamentarians from all around the world. I think that this type of activity is particularly important because it really enriches us and it gives us information which allows us to be able to bear them in mind in the work that we have as, in my case, co-facilitator of the political declaration for the UNGAS this year. I think that firstly, the message that we want to send out is that we need to strengthen the UNGAS. UNCAC. It needs to be made very clear that UNCAC is an instrument which serves as a basis for fighting cooperation. We obviously need to also bear in mind that we need to look ahead towards the future and renew our political commitment. And in so doing, we need to involve not only governments, parliaments, civil society, and private sector as well. So the fight against corruption is a scourge in which we all need to be involved and in which we all need to work hand in hand. For this reason, it's important that the declaration should also include innovative proposals. I think that this is a challenge that we have to face. We need to make it clear that we're not only reiterating the commitment that has been made through the various agreements and commitments that already exist, but we also need to look at how we can further commit to working in the future. And if you'll allow me, I'd just like to once again reiterate the importance of the establishment of this working group in Peru, which is looking at which improvements we can make to the convention, and we hope to be able to benefit from the full support of all of the countries around the world to that end. Finally, obviously, this really is a commitment that we are promoting and through which transparency is a fundamental part. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you. And once again, I'd like to reiterate my thanks for this invitation and congratulate you once again on this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Machado. I'd now like to give the floor for her final remarks to Ms. Waly, Executive Director of the UNODC. Madam, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for your able moderation. I would like to reiterate 2 points. The first point is the role of parliamentarians. Parliamentarians have a crucial role to play, and they can specifically do the following. They can exercise the legislative power necessary to spur more effective anti-corruption laws and institutions. They can hold the executive branches to account and ensure that action is taken in response to findings of the UNCAC review mechanisms, and directly or indirectly, parliamentarians can contribute to a more effective implementation of the Anti-Corruption Convention. On another hand, we have now the momentum and the opportunity to elevate and advance global anti-corruption action and to recover better by recovering with integrity. So the time is now. While governments support the economy to lay the foundation for post-pandemic economic recovery, the proper management of the public resources is of utmost importance. The same applies to international assistance to developing countries. So we need a coordinated approach, and this has become imperative, and we are fostering information sharing and networking between the different practitioners to allow this integrated approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I would like to give the final word to Cynthia Lopez Castro, to conclude this session.
Thank you so much. I thanks for the invitation. I think it has been very interesting to hear all your participation. It's time to unite as parliamentarians, to share practices in our countries, to be in communication. I have proposed in the chat an informal WhatsApp group so we can share some of these practices, so we can be in touch. And I think so if you want, you can put your name and your phone number if you want to be in touch and share the practices of your country. So as has been well said here, only united as one world we can make the change. The fight against corruption is done with laws, but also with people committed to doing different things. Let us honor the concept of politics that is so worn out in the world today. And well, as a member of Young Parliament, a member of the board of the IPU of Young Parliamentarians, I'm ready to work with you to propose and adopt measures globally. Corruption has been a way of life and has become embedded in the political veins. So we have to remove it. We have to make politics a vocation of service and eliminate corruption in our countries. So I think that let's work together to achieve it. Your participation has been very valuable. Let's continue. Let's be in communication. Let's keep working. Let's support each other to achieve greater transparency in our country. So today, I think we are being part of this Declaration of United Nations, and we appreciate that a lot that we have been taking into account. We all have a lot of things to learn and to participate. And well, I think today is the first step towards an intensive work against corruption. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure and an honor to share this morning from Mexico with you. Thank you so much. And continue working all together against corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our distinguished speakers and to our keynote speaker, also Ms. Rubio. And indeed, we are going to now watch a video which is produced by Transparency International. We are going to take a break for 5 minutes. Please do come back because we have a very interesting session for you on the subject that has been mentioned many times by our speakers of grand corruption. But first, we're going to show you a short video. Thank you.
To us, it's simple. Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Whether it's paying a bribe to access public services like healthcare and education, or whether it's money laundering schemes involving billions in dirty money, what's important is how corruption affects you. And the cost of corruption can be enormous. Corruption can cost you your livelihood, your rights, your health, your freedom, and sometimes even your life. It erodes democratic freedoms, rule of law, and trust in government. Corruption also reduces your chances for a healthy environment and sustainable future. When money meant to tackle the climate crisis is stolen, that's your future being taken from you. When money meant to improve your local schools, hospitals, and roads is snatched away, opportunities for a better life are lost with it. When money meant to improve your government and the rule of law is stolen, so too is your chance for a more just and secure future. Every year we lose billions to corruption, billions that were supposed to improve all of our lives, our opportunities, and our communities. At times, the scale of the problem can seem overwhelming, but corruption is not inevitable. Together, we have the power to stop corruption. Join us. To us, it's simple. Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Whether it's paying a bribe to access public services like healthcare and education, or whether it's money laundering schemes involving billions in dirty money, what's important is how corruption affects you. And the cost of corruption can be enormous. Corruption can cost you your livelihood, your rights, your health, your freedom, and sometimes even your life. It erodes democratic freedoms, rule of law, and trust in government. Corruption also reduces your chances for a healthy environment and sustainable future. When money meant to tackle the climate crisis is stolen, that's your future being taken from you. When money meant to improve your local schools, hospitals, and roads is snatched away, opportunities for a better life are lost with it. When money meant to improve your government and the rule of law is stolen, so too is your chance for a more just and secure future. Every year we lose billions to corruption, billions that were supposed to improve all of our lives, our opportunities, and our communities. At times, the scale of the problem can seem overwhelming. But corruption is not inevitable. Together, we have the power to stop corruption. Join us.
Welcome back, everybody. We're now going to have our concluding session, and we're going to be discussing something that is being negotiated in Vienna at the moment. It is about creating an international anti-corruption court or other mechanism. And the objective is to prosecute leaders who've taken bribes or who are stealing from the public purse outright, knowing that they'll most probably go unpunished because of close ties with judiciary. And we have 3 speakers in this session. And my first speaker is the Justice Richard Goldstone, co-founder and board member of Integrity Initiatives International. And Justice Goldstone is a strong proponent of this anti-corruption court. We'll then be hearing from the Norwegian ambassador, who is not necessarily a proponent of the court, but of another mechanism. And then we'll be hearing from Juan Fernando Lopez Aguilar, former Spanish minister and now a member of the European Parliament, who will be giving his views on both proposals. But we would really, parliamentarians, like to hear your view. Which one do you support? So I shall be coming to you afterwards. But first of all, let me give the floor to Justice Richard Goldstone, co-founder and board member of Integrity Initiatives International. Sir, you have 10 minutes to make your case.
Thank you very much indeed. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. As we know, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, is one of the most widely ratified international conventions, 187 parties. We know too that UNCAC requires member states to enact domestic anti-corruption laws. These include the prevention of extortion, bribery, and money laundering. The majority of member states, the states parties to UNCAC, have done so. These laws have hardly deterred grand corruption or kleptocracy, corruption at the level of the highest officials of state. The reason is not difficult to locate. UNCAC is government-driven and relies on governments to implement the convention and the laws promulgated pursuant to it. The kleptocrats are invariably in control of their own governments. UNCAC says very little about the mechanisms for enforcement of the provisions of the convention or the domestic laws that it requires. Its provisions against political corruption, not surprisingly, therefore, are weak The consequence is that every year grand corruption, has diverted trillions of dollars from public resources such as healthcare, education, and economic opportunity, the very issues we saw highlighted in the impressive video from Transparency International. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in enormous corruption by public officials in many countries, including, unfortunately, my own. It is a sad commentary on human nature that so many women and men are prepared for their own selfish interests to deprive the victims of the pandemic of the care that they require for their very survival. Kleptocrats operate with impunity. They steal vast sums and in most cases launder their ill-gotten gains in safe havens such as Switzerland, Singapore, the Cayman Islands, and others. The conclusion, unfortunately, I would suggest, is that we must recognize that UNCAC has substantially failed to curb or deter grand corruption, kleptocracy. The criminals are protected by their control over their own criminal justice systems. They control the police and prosecuting authorities, and sometimes the courts themselves. The solution can only lie in an international mechanism with authority and power to freeze the laundered money and to investigate and punish the kleptocrats or grand corruptors. One obviously thinks of the International Criminal Court. However, for it to be effective in this field, the field of grand corruption, the Rome Statute would require amendment. That would necessitate a long process, including a 2/3 majority vote by its 123 states parties. And even if that is attained, it would not enter into force until 7/8 of the states parties have ratified it. This is not practically feasible. Even apart from that difficulty, it is highly unlikely that an ICC prosecutor would prioritize economic crimes above egregious war crimes, including genocide. The only solution is an international anti-corruption court, IACC. It would be staffed by experienced judges and prosecutors and have authority to enforce relevant domestic laws, as well as crimes of corruption defined in its founding statute. The IACC would operate on the basis of complementarity. That is, its jurisdiction would be triggered only if the domestic authorities of the state of the kleptocrat were unable or unwilling to investigate the crime. An important benefit of complementarity is that it would encourage domestic investigations and prosecutions. That is a lesson that we've certainly learned from the ICC. Whether or not there are domestic prosecutions, the IACC would be empowered to order the disgorgement and restitution of illicit assets for the benefit of the victims. The IACC could also partly be funded by the proceeds of stolen assets. The question is asked, would the IACC be politically feasible? A common criticism of the IACC is that the kleptocrats would not permit their countries to join such a court. Apart from the fact that kleptocrats sooner or later are likely to be out of office, the IACC could seize assets that are held in states that join the IACC and in which the illicit assets are situated. If the IACC is able to attract the membership of, say, 20 to 25 countries, at least some of which are financial centers in which kleptocrats launder their money, it would have the capacity to prosecute kleptocrats from non-party states. The crimes would in effect be continued and conducted in the safe haven. The IACC has made great progress since a few years ago when Colombia announced that it would call on the UN to establish the IACC. We know and we've heard frequent references to the fact that in June of this year, the General Assembly is convening the special session on corruption known as UNGAS 2021. There apparently is some hope that some major nations might play a role in establishing such a court. I would suggest that if one is serious about deterring kleptocracy, if we are serious about it, there is no alternative but to establish the IACC. That is the major part of the mission of Integrity Initiatives International, a relatively new civil society organization that is working to achieve support for the IACC. In concluding, may I say that be a little bit undiplomatic and express some disappointment that the draft declaration for UNGAS 21 appears to make no reference to the deterrence of kleptocracy or grand corruption, or even the consideration of an IACC. I would express the hope that it is not too late to rectify that omission. It makes me all the more grateful to the Inter-Parliamentary Union for including this topic at its annual Inter-Parliamentary hearing and for inviting me to talk about the IACC. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justice Goldstone, for making the case for the International Anti-Corruption Court. I would now like to ask Ambassador Kjersti Andersen, Permanent Representative of Norway to the UN in Vienna, to make her case. And Ambassador, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It has been indeed a very interesting few hours that we have spent together. I will just give a little bit of a background, I think, and maybe an update on where we are now in Vienna. In 2019, the UNODC convened an expert meeting on corruption in Oslo. And these experts came up with 64 different expert recommendations about preventing and combating corruption involving vast quantities of assets. Now, the experts agreed that innovative ideas to end impunity should be explored. And one of those proposals was to create an international anti-corruption court that the judge has just explained to us and taken us through some of the main points. So I will not spend a lot of time discussing it, but such a court might help address grand corruption by strengthening deterrence, by motivating countries to improve their domestic justice systems, and by communicating a strong international disapproval of grand corruption. And it may break the vicious corruption impunity cycle, which is a huge problem. Now, there are several counter-arguments to establish such a court. Leaders who enjoy de facto impunity for grand corruption are unlikely to submit to the jurisdiction of such a court. Coercive measures are unlikely to be feasible, and such a court may not have sufficient tools to be able to effectively prosecute grand corruption. Prosecutors at international tribunals depend almost entirely on cooperation from domestic agencies. And another counter-argument has been that the court may not be cost-effective. So there are arguments circulating both in favor and against. And there is, I would say, so far in our discussions on the political declaration on gas, this is not the topic that we have discussed the most. That could change because we're now entering into a more intense phase of UNGAS preparations. I would like to go back to the Oslo statement and the experts, because they also recommend other innovative ideas that could be further analyzed and discussed. And I will mention a few of them. It could be possible to establish an international special rapporteur for anti-corruption. It could be possible to develop a protocol to the UNCAC on corruption involving vast quantities of assets. It could be worthwhile exploring the possibility of extending the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court to include corruption of vast quantities of assets. It could also be possible to create an international commission or international commissions against corruption and impunity. And it would be possible to elevate the Jakarta Statement on Principles for Anti-Corruption Agencies from 2012 to a more binding instrument. Now, finally, on the issue on impunity, these experts recommended that national audit institutions should strengthen their cooperation with national anti-corruption authorities where appropriate, including by using the full potential of audits and ensuring appropriate follow-up action to their reports. As with other oversight bodies, measures should be put in place to ensure that their actions are in accordance with international standards. So whatever assessment one may have of the proposal to establish an international anti-corruption court, the international community should and needs to pursue efforts to address the corruption impunity problem. And there are several options available. And they could also be applied in some form of combination. And Norway would like to see this corruption impunity challenge effectively addressed in the political declaration that we are in the process of negotiating. I think that I will stop there because we do not have much time and we have more people on the panel. And I would really like to hear from those listening in, the participants, on their views and comments back to us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you to our two speakers with the arguments and counter-arguments and counter-proposals. And indeed, in a moment, I will be asking parliamentarians to really give your view on these proposals. We'd like to test the political temperature. But before I do that, I'm going to give the floor to a former Spanish justice minister, a member of the European Parliament and chair of the Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. So it's my pleasure to ask Juan Lopez Aguiar to give his view on the two proposals. Sir, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. First of all, good afternoon to you all. It's my pleasure and my honor to be able to address you this afternoon. And I appreciate the opportunity, considering that I myself, I'm a member of a parliament. I was just hearing the previous panel, members of parliament. I am a member of parliament. I am the chair of the Committee of Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs of the European Parliament. And that is the approach which I'm going to be sharing with you. First of all, the importance of the Lisbon Treaty entering into force and making the European Parliament, for once, a criminal lawmaker. We are legislators on criminal matters. We are legislators on and against cross-border serious crime. We're also legislator on the procedural guarantees, and we're also legislator on fundamental rights. And all of these elements are involved when tackling corruption, when cracking down corruption. Of course, it is important to be aware that fighting against grand corruption implies, with no doubt, international cooperation. 2005 UN Convention Against Corruption, as an example, nothing less than 187 parties. But it also takes global actors being of relevance when cracking down on corruption with a common strategy. And the committee I chair, Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, requested from the Commission, by then, in the first mandate in which the Lisbon Treaty entered into force, Commissioner Malmström, Home Commissioner, a strategy against corruption and a map against corruption across Europe, because there is cross-border corruption all over Europe. And it takes not only a strategy, but also a set of legislatives when it comes to lawmaking. And that's what precisely the pathway that we have covered so far, and it's yet to be completed. Of course, we put in place a number of pieces of legislation dealing with cross-border serious crimes. We established a number of pieces of legislation of a criminal law nature, but also we were of the essence when putting in place the European Public Prosecutor Office, which is precisely meant, according to the Lisbon Treaty, Article 86, to combat crimes affecting first the financial interests of the EU, but then also other forms, a variety of crimes of cross-border nature, including, of course, not only corruption, misappropriation, fraud, but also all sorts of illicit traffickings, including trafficking of human beings, and the proceeds of the profits of those illicit businesses, including money laundering. The European Public Prosecutor Office is finally in place. We have a European Public Prosecutor, but it only shows the obstacle of putting in place new national and international institutions. Let's think, for instance, of an international anti-corruption court. No, not easy, not an easy task. Looking at the obstacles that we have faced in order to put in place the European Public Prosecutor in the context of fight against grand corruption and fraud and misappropriation, we see the challenges ahead. So, first of all, I think we should be learning from experience and trying, of course, to fill with content all the institutions, the array of institutions which are already at site. Other tools have been highlighted after the 2005 UN Convention Against Corruption, and it has to be more efficient. I would like to refer to the prevention and criminal piece of legislation on money laundering and the freezing and confiscation of illegally obtained property. That is a legislation that we have adopted in the European Parliament. Instruments meant to prevent money laundering. And of course, fighting against the impunity of perpetrators, a strategy against tax evasion, against tax fraud, against tax havens must also go European. It's the only way we can actually be meaningful regarding the challenges of globalization when dealing with cross-border criminal offenses. In that regard, the European Union has also been, I would say, successful in the last 10 years, putting in place anti-money laundering directives. Actually, we see now the fifth anti-money laundering directive, preventing the use of financial systems for money laundering on terrorist financing. And the directive of 2018 is the last version. They have very resolute rules in order to protect politically exposed persons with special diligence required beneficial owners to identify them, and registers, enhancing the powers of EU financial intelligence units to provide them with access to broad information for the carrying out of the tasks, as well as providing for a list of high-risk third country with non-adequate anti-money laundering systems. And finally, in addition, Directive of 2018 on combating money laundering by criminal law, laying down rules facilitating the use of financial and other information for the prevention, detection, investigation, or prosecution, or certain criminal offenses, provided additional tools precisely for that purposes. Broad definition of money laundering, common definitions of criminal offenses across the European Union, and of course the need to put in place the identification of true bank account holders containing national centralized registers, and to access certain information from national financial intelligence units, which are a must for the member states of the European Union as the legislation is in place. And we have also adopted a group of common definition of criminal offenses, including corruption offenses, broader forms of confiscation, extended confiscation, and non-conviction based confiscation, at least in cases of illness and absconding, as well as an easy system of mutual recognition of confiscation systems in the European Union. So it leads in all to criminal law cooperation, judicial cooperation, police cooperations. There are two agencies which report regularly to the committee which I chair. Europol, meant to organize the police cooperation against cross-border serious crime across Europe, and Eurojust, which is meant to secure judicial cooperation in criminal matters, and which was actually the embryo for the put in place of the European Public Prosecution. Those mentioned instruments reflect, I think, to some extent, the spirit and norms of the 2005 UN Anti-Corruption Convention, showing some efficiency in a way forward, which is to be unfolded and developed in a more indirect but still effective way, as they work where it hurts most regarding illegal money and the proceeds of corruption. So in all, it takes cracking down on corruption, cracking down on the proceeds of corruption, following the money, follow the money, cui prodest, and fighting against the impunity of corruption all across the European Union. Of course, we are all aware that the map of corruption is very varied in the European Union, but the strategy has been set forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aguirre. And I would now really like to hear from parliamentarians about what you think of the proposals that Justice Goldstone has made, what you think about the proposal of the ambassador and her other options. And after I've heard from parliamentarians on this specific issue, I will go back to Ambassador Anderson and Justice Goldstone for their final remarks. But let me now give the floor for 2 minutes to the parliamentarian from Kenya. The floor is yours.
Yeah, good evening, and I hope that you can hear me.
We can, loud and clear.
Yes, I am Jacqueline Doole, a member of the National Assembly of Kenya, and I would like, in appreciation of the very thorough discussion and proposal of instruments to help curb and end corruption, to say that as much as I recognize that it is useful to have an international court, based on the experience that we have in Kenya, think that it would be much more appropriate to go along with the ideas such as of special rapporteur or to include corruption element in the ICC. I say this because in Kenya, we have had experience in terms of having two of our leaders come to the ICC. And unfortunately, because there is a perception that the cost is very high and that there needs to be a way that the country itself exhausts its domestic instruments, I would urge that the way we would best address this matter, given the pervasive and the spread of corruption, that to the extent that it has almost become something that people have given up on how to address, that it is important to address the spirit, and the spirit would be best addressed by allowing room, such as of a special rapporteur, where there would be room in the country for the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary to have a conversation within, and not to imply that we have already then determined that this is only a matter that can be addressed by law. I conclude by saying that in my opinion and experience, you can legislate against exclusion, you can legislate against corruption, but you usually need more than legislation in order to include, to change the perspective, and indeed to change the culture so that we end corruption. Hence my feeling that the other innovative ideas are much more appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the parliamentarian from Kenya for making your point so clear. And as I said, I will go back to our speakers for their responses after we've heard from more parliamentarians. Thank you for joining us, sir, from Kenya, where it must be quite late in the evening. We would very much like to hear your views on the proposals that have been put forward when wanting to deal with grand corruption. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, sir. Please make your remarks.
Thank you so much. I want first of all to thank the presenters. On the onset, I would like to say that the idea of an international court, it may not find its place, because just with ICC, what we had is the developing countries were the ones actually that went before the ICC. But the developed countries were not comfortable to come on board. Secondly, what corruption entails, it is a two-sided coin. There's the person who is giving the corrupt deals, and there are those who are receiving. So for that reason, I think the major problem that the international community must identify is to make sure that there is cooperation from the domestic actors, because really, before this thing becomes international, there must be attempt by the local actors to deal with the situation. Thirdly, corruption, it is now pronounced to be a major issue globally. So more than anything, it calls for a sort of international solidarity where countries across the globe must be able to cooperate in terms of human resources, in terms of research, in terms of even trying to follow up on money trail or money laundering trail, as our colleague from the European Parliament is saying. The idea of international solidarity is so important. Finally, it is about innovative ideas, because corruption entails many things. As your video tried to depict, it is about democracy, it is about infrastructure, it entails so many things. That is why when we have innovative ideas that we can borrow from Poland, we can borrow from South Africa, we can borrow from the United Kingdom, so that the best practices is what you as a country will try to enforce. I thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed. It is innovative ideas that we're looking for. I would now like to go to the parliamentarian from Guyana. Madam, the floor is yours. Well, that is a great shame, because it would have been very nice to have gone to the different corners of the globe, but I understand that Guyana is having problems connecting, just as the other people too. So as I don't see any hands raised on this particular session, I would like to go back to Justice Goldstone to make some final remarks, and then to Ambassador Anderson to make some final remarks. Justice Goldstone, the floor is yours. And could you please unmute yourself?
Okay, can you hear?
We can hear you. But I'm afraid I was over-optimistic.
Oh,
Could you,
okay,
now it's perfect.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much indeed. It was a most interesting discussion, and thank you very much for moderating this session and the previous session so efficiently. The question of the ICC obviously is something that is bound to be raised in the context of setting up yet another international criminal tribunal. And I don't think there's time now to really discuss the International Criminal Court. But let me say one huge advantage that an IACC, an International Anti-Corruption Court, would have is that it could lay its hands, as I mentioned earlier, on ill-gotten gains. Grand corruptors, kleptocrats, don't keep their money at home. They farm it out. They launder it in what they regard to be safe havens. And an international anti-corruption court could lay its hands on those ill-gotten gains, and in that way achieve jurisdiction. This, I would suggest, would be a huge, huge advantage and also a huge deterrent against corruptors sending their money abroad. And obviously, they would be very nervous, and rightly so, to keep it at home. You never know how the politics will play out. In the case of the Yugoslavia Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal, with which I was intimately involved, nobody thought that Slobodan Milosevic would ever end up in court in The Hague, or Karadzic or Mladic, and yet they did. They would have bet their lives on that not happening. The leaders, the horrible leaders who were responsible for the Rwanda genocide never thought that they would appear in an international tribunal, yet they did. So I think it's very important to have an international mechanism which is a last resort. The first resort, obviously, are the courts of the country where the crimes are committed, in the countries of the kleptocrats or grand corruptors. But the system of complementarity that applies also to the ICC would mean that the International Anti-Corruption Court would not have any jurisdiction unless and until the courts of the country concerned indicate that they're unable or unwilling to step in. Let me, in conclusion, say, with regard to the alternative suggestions put by Her Excellency the Ambassador for Norway, I don't believe that the alternatives really have teeth. An international rapporteur is not going to get any attention paid to her or to him by a grand corruptor or kleptocrat. A protocol to UNCAC, how many years would that take to achieve? And the issue, it seems to me, is how most efficiently and how most swiftly one can introduce an international mechanism to put a stop to this grand corruption that is costing victims, as I said, many billions of dollars annually. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justice Goldstone. So let me ask Ambassador Anderson to respond to those comments that your proposals don't have sufficient teeth, and perhaps to some of the comments from the parliamentarians that we've heard. Madam Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I would just like to underline that these are not my suggestions or proposals. These are experts' recommendations coming out of a 3-day-long meeting in Oslo, 64 different recommendations. And there are pros and cons of many of them. And I think one of the parliamentarians said that we need innovative ideas, and that is sort of my message, because there is no question about it. Corruption with impunity is a major challenge, and it is something that many UN member states really struggle with and try to work against, and that is why we need all these different approaches and ideas to explore what are not only the best solutions, but what is possible for us to agree on and to implement and to follow up. So I think there are many steps here that we need to look into. But I would like to just say that that is a discussion that we need to keep going. We will not solve it today. We will definitely keep focusing on it and discuss it in Vienna. But I think parliamentarians are, of course, crucial in the fight against corruptions, because you have the power to legislate. But I would also like to just maybe conclude by repeating what the parliamentarian from Kenya, the first parliamentarian from Kenya, said. We also need culture to change, and to combat corruption, societies need both an anti-corruption culture and legislation. So I think we're looking into to different aspects here. It's a complex area to work with, but we need all the good ideas and we need to explore them. We need to, in Vienna, we are also consensus-based, so we need to have consensus on what we decide and then move on. But thank you for having me on this panel today.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much also to Justice Goldstone, and also thank you very much for our discussant, Mr. Lopez Aguiar. So we have come to the end of today's session. So again, thank you to the President of the Inter-Parliamentary Union and the President of the UN General Assembly who started the discussion. And indeed, they were mentioning some of the subjects that we are going to be discussing tomorrow. We're going to be looking at the issue of gender and corruption, a long neglected issue, and we will be discussing that tomorrow. And also high on your priorities, the issue of whistleblower protection and also the financing of political parties. So please do join us for tomorrow's session. All I have to say to you now is thank you for joining us from all around the world. Good afternoon or good evening. Thank you.